All right, welcome, and thank you for tuning in to this virtual Mix 2020 session. My name is Andrew Berns. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science at the University of Northern Iowa, and I'm going to talk today about a project that I've been working on with Dr. Philip East, also of the Department of Computer Science at the University of Northern Iowa. And the title of our talk today is going to be Grading for Equity, a rationale and guide for instructional change. Diving right in, we'll just get started on why it is that we grade. We know that grading is everywhere. It's something that all of us faculty are going to do. It's also something that faculty frequently loathe, but we do it because, at least in our minds, it has a couple of valuable pieces. Number one, we hope that it's a fair measure of student capabilities, that we can use it for comparison between two students, that we can use it to communicate or to convey to future instructors how well they learn the material, to future employers how well they learn the material. And so that's one reason why we grade, is that we need to communicate their capabilities to others fairly. We grade because we hopefully will provide students with feedback so that they can use that to improve. So we might want to tell a student, you don't know, say, iteration very well, but maybe you are really good at selection. And so grading is a way for us to do that, because we can assign a value or somehow get them that feedback and let them know where they stand. Tied into that, we'd also hope that our grading is going to motivate students to improve, that they're going to take a look at their scores and say, what, I want to learn the best I can, and so I'm going to keep working at it until I get high scores. And then we'd also, of course, like grading at a higher level to give us a measurement of our teaching effectiveness. So we'd like to be able to look back and say, oh, I didn't teach, say, selection very well, or I didn't teach iteration very well. And then use the scores that we've given to close the loop and go back and improve our teaching. So these are the reasons why we undertake this loathsome task of grading frequently. So what kinds of things do we use when we do our grading? We'll define this as our traditional grading practices. So these are the mechanisms we used to use to grade before we found some better systems. And a lot of these you'll probably be familiar to you as well. So for instance, we used a 100-point percentage scale. So at the end of the semester, everybody's work was kind of calculated as out of 100, 0 to 100. We might even grade individual assignments out of, say, 100 points, and then just scale them at the end. Out of those 100 points, they were divided pretty standardly into the A, B, C, D, F scale that you see here. You had 10 points for an A, 10 points for a B, 10 points for a C, 60 to 69 would be a D, and then everything below that would be considered a failure. We would, of course, take everything the student had done throughout the semester, whether it be homework assignments, they might have done some projects, some quizzes, we might have included attendance scores, participation, things like that. We took all of those, kind of weighted them together, maybe averaged out different sections, and then used that to compute that 100-point score, and then from there used our traditional grading ranges. While we graded exams, project attendance, things like that, the means that we were using to give students feedback was almost exclusively the homework. So we were hoping, hey, we gave them this activity to do so they would learn, we would assign them a score, and then they would go back and say, oh, I didn't do as well, I got a 8 out of 10 or 80 out of 100 on this, and then we would write some comments as well to go along with that to try to help them improve. And then, of course, if they, didn't behave, quote unquote, in the way that we wanted them to, we might give them a 0. So we might say, well, if you're late, maybe if you're a day or two past the deadline, I'll give you a 0. If you plagiarize your work, I would give you a 0, obviously, things like that. So this was kind of our traditional grading practice that we were used to, and our thought was that it would meet the goals that we had just talked about. Then we came upon this idea of equitable grading. So what is equitable grading? Well, what brought us to the idea was actually a book called Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. We definitely highly recommend this book. I would encourage everybody to go out, get yourself a copy, check one out from the library, take a look at it. The principles, or at least the key idea with that, is that equitable grading consists of consists of practices that satisfy three particular categories. These practices should be, number one, mathematically accurate. That is, they should reflect a student's academic performance. So if two students have, say, the same score, that if they were accurate, they would then have the same performance, or should demonstrate the same capabilities. Grading or equitable grading schemes should also be bias resistant. Grades should be completely objective. They should avoid subjectivity, both from obviously explicit bias, but also implicit bias or unintentional biases that might be introduced that we are not aware of or we don't intend to have happen. And then, of course, we would like grading to also be motivational. That they would take grading as another input as they work to gain lifelong learning skills. So okay, this is the goal where I want to be. This is where I'm at right now. I'm going to go ahead and work harder to hit that. So equitable grading practices are any of those that satisfy those three criteria. So we looked at our traditional grading practices. How do they stand up to the equitable grading standard? Is what we're doing working for those? And we actually, of course, came up with this idea that the way we were doing grading, our traditional grading practices, were not mathematically accurate. They were not bias resistant, and they were not motivational for students. And I parenthetically included for faculty either, as not only were our traditional grading practices not working for students, we didn't enjoy doing it either. And so, if we, by looking at our grading through this lens of equitable grading, we came to the conclusion that what we were doing wasn't working. And what I'd like to do now is kind of walk through a few of the things that we were doing, and try to justify our thoughts on why they don't fit. And then there's some more details of these ideas in our paper as well. So let's take a look at, probably the number one thing, or the thing that takes up most of our grading time, is the idea of homework. It turns out, when we evaluated it, homework actually doesn't work. At least it doesn't work for grading as we intended. So number one, when we design homework assignments, we're designing them to help students learn, not to assess what they know. So I might have students do a practice maybe much more drill-like by writing multiple, say, for loops, to do simple things, ASCII triangles, or the sum of the first n numbers. The idea isn't that I want students to be able to make ASCII art. It's that I've given them this activity so that they learn about iteration, so they can apply that in more authentic settings. So I've designed homework not to really measure their capabilities, but rather to help them learn. But then if I'm going to go ahead and actually score that, I'm going to use that in their grades, by definition that's going to be inaccurate. Again, I'm using, as part of the grades, which is supposed to reflect their capabilities, I'm using something that really is a reflection of what I think they should do to learn. Another reason why homework wasn't working, not every student, of course, can complete the homework by the time. They might have, external life circumstances that are preventing them for particular weeks or for particular time periods for finishing as we expect. They might simply work slower, and it may take them longer to finish an assignment, and it might take them multiple times. They may not get it. They may think they do. They might need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever attempts to actually get that information in there. And the point is that all of these things are happening, or all of these reasons that might prevent them from turning it on time, are things that happen from factors outside of their control. And so if we were to use those scores in their final grade, we'd also introduce this bias. Again, an implicit bias. We don't intend for it to be that way, but there's factors outside of a student's control which don't reflect capability that are influencing their grades. And then, of course, if we assign points to our homework, which we frequently did, it really stresses an extrinsic motivation, telling students you're really only doing this for the points. We're penalizing them for factors outside their control. We're really sending mixed messages about learning as a process. We're saying, hey, it might take you some time to learn that. That's okay. Oh, but by the way, if you don't learn it, at the time that I tell you to, and demonstrate it in the way that I tell you to, or at least demonstrate it through the use of these drill, learning activities, then I'm going to penalize you. And so that can actually be motivate or demotivational. So one thing we said when we were redesigning our grading practices is, what should we do with homework? What's the alternative? Well, we decided don't, right? Don't do homework. At least, I should rephrase that. Don't do homework to use for grading. We'll rather assign homework, have students do it, but it won't factor into their final grade. So we'll look at some other things that we've had. We had some problems with our traditional grading scale. So number one, we had this 90, 80, 70, 60, pretty common grade cutoffs. If we look at that just from a logical standpoint, what we're saying is that there's 10 different ways to get an A, 10 different ways to get a B, etc. But we're actually saying there's 60 different ways to get an F. Number one, do we need that level of granularity? Is it really true that there's 10 different ways to get an A? And then number two, is it really true that 60 different ways to get an F? Do we really need more ways to label a failure than we do to label one of the possible successes? So just from a logical standpoint, that grade system, that division kind of seems weird. It also leads to some unintended or perhaps intended consequences. So for instance, if 60 and below makes an F, if the range for Fs are so big, and we assign a 0, say for you turned in something late, or you failed to turn something in, as we had done in the past, and we'll talk about that. But if we assign a 0, now instead of being at the bottom of a 10-point scale, you're at the bottom of a 60-point scale. And so if somebody had, say, 2 Bs and then a missing assignment, or they turned in an F, if they had 2 Bs and then they got a 0 in a component, so they did get an F, that would result in dropping their score down into the F range. And that might not actually be our intent, right? Does it make sense that somebody who has successfully and fairly well demonstrated that they can do 2 out of the 3 things we've assigned, does it really make sense for them to have failed the course? Or is there some sort of a middle ground? And again, these are side effects of having this bigger grading scale. So what kinds of things can we do differently? Well, we recommend both shrinking the grading scale and balancing it. So shrinking it in the sense that we no longer need the 10 ways to say an A, the 10 ways to say a B, and balancing it in that we want the number of ways for us to denote an F to be the same as the number of ways that we can denote, say, an A. So we've experimented with some binary grading. Maybe we'd go to a 4-point scale, like GPAs are calculated, A, B, C, D, and F, or even if we want a granularity, a 15-point scale, where for each letter grade you had a plus, middle, and a minus. All of those systems seem to make sense. They're all small enough where it makes sense that we might actually want that level of granularity, but they're also balanced. There's the same number of ways to get an F as there is to get an A, and then when we end up with those cases where a student might have a 0 but a couple of Bs, it's not necessarily the case that they're going to fail. We can actually get them a more accurate score about their capabilities. All right. So what are some other problems that we've had? Things that what we would call behavioral grading modifiers. So if you look back and you think about your grading, or we looked at our grading, and we realized that we had a variety of ways where a student's score would come from something other than their performance on the objectives of the class, and almost always or frequently these were things related to the student's behavior, which was not actually part of the learning objectives. So for instance, late work. Again, there's things outside of a student's control that might result in them turning something in late. They might have, be having to work 40 hours a week. They might have, a family at home to take care of. They might learn a little slower than others. So for a number of reasons, they might turn work in late. And by us penalizing that, by us saying, if you turn it in after the deadline, that's a 0, we're punishing them for things that have nothing to do with their performance. If you turn in a perfect assignment, a day after I say, you get a 0, even though you know how to do it. You know how to do it a day too late, 24 hours too late, or 2 hours too late. And so that was one of the ways that a behavioral modifier might come into play, which again then brings up some bias and can bring up some inaccuracies in our grading. Shared work as well. If we were penalizing late work, it decreases the students' motivation to work hard on their own because they know they're time boxed. It increases the motivation for them to cheat, to share work, to plagiarize. And again, if we assign them a 0 for doing that, particularly if we assign them a 0 for doing that on a homework assignment, we're saying, hey, you made a bad behavioral choice, and so we're going to actually deduct your grade, which is then going to make our grade inaccurate. Now, of course, we do need to avoid plagiarism, academic dishonesty when it comes time for our assessments. But if we're looking at something like, say, homework assignments, which we're not including with the grade, by all means, work with other people on those. At the end of the day, do we really care how you get to the point where you know the objectives, just so long as you know the objectives? And so, that was another behavioral thing factoring in. Attendance. We'd like to think that coming to class is going to help you learn, and so we might try to incentivize that by giving points. But again, attendance we think helps you learn, but it's not an indicator of learning. If we bring it into grading, we now have an inaccurate grading system. And there's other reasons why somebody may not be attending. Again, external life circumstances, work, etc. On a similar vein, participation. Participation is a good, or we'd like to think participation will help you learn, but it's not an indicator of what you've learned. And so awarding students who speak up in class means that their scores are going to be inaccurate. It can also introduce cultural biases. So, for instance, cultures where disagreeing or speaking up with the professor with not showing them deference is going to be seen as a negative sign. And so we definitely don't want to be punishing students who, for whatever reason, factors outside their control, do not like to participate due to both, again, the bias and the inaccuracy parts. Group work, extra credit is another one where we might say, I'd like to be able to raise people's score. I want to get them interested. So here's what I'll do. I'll give them an activity that I want them to maybe do just to try to, behave more like or get the chance to dive into something more. It has nothing to do with the objectives. But if you do it, I'll give you extra points. By the very definition there, this is something that's going to lead to inaccurate grading. We're basically admitting, here's something that you wouldn't have to do to meet all the objectives, but if you do it, I'm going to reward you. That's going to lead to inaccuracy. It can also lead to unintentional biases, again, by, let's say, one of the extra credit activities is, say, doing a job shadow, which I've been guilty of doing in the past. Well, that means that's only available to students who don't have to work during that time and who can arrange transportation to get there. And so doing extra credit is inaccurate and can lead to biases. And then finally, of course, we think of group work. Frequently we'll say you're going to work in a group and everybody in the group gets the same score, or everybody starts with the same score and we make adjustments. That's going to lead to inaccuracies because if one person does all the work, then some people will get a higher score than they deserve. Some people might get a lower score. Now, of course, group work is going to be an integral part of most of their jobs, and it's an important skill to learn. But most of the time when we grade group work, we're not actually grading their ability to work as a team. We're simply grading the final product. And so, yes, there are cases where we might want to teach students how to work in a group, but for us, the vast majority of the times we were actually evaluating their group work. We weren't evaluating their ability to work in a group, and so we were introducing, of course, the inaccuracies for it. So our recommendation as far as the behavioral modifiers, similar to homework, we suggest we just don't do it. So in our grading schemes going forward, we have removed all of these kinds of things from how we grade. One of the things we've tried to do in our previous grading systems was use grades for motivation to highlight to students, try to incentivize behaviors that we want. Inside of Feldman's book, he actually cites several research studies about how grades factor into motivation. We'll cite some of these here. Number one, they find that if you have contingent extrinsic rewards, it actually undermines intrinsic motivation. So we'd like to be, cultivating lifelong learners, but by assigning grades to them, we're actually undermining that. We're saying, you know what, if there's not going to be a point system or a point order with it, you're not going to do it. And I know I've certainly had that experience with students in classes saying, if it's not worth any points, why would I do that? And again, using a points-based system like we do with grading is encouraging that, as Feldman points out. Feldman also points out that there's been evidence that if you use extrinsic motivation, it actually lowers the creativity, the complex thinking, and then it also increases the unethical behavior. Again, if you want the reward, you have the best benefit in doing it exactly the way that's been described, avoiding creativity, avoiding new approaches that might end up in you losing that extra bonus points. And then of course it also can put you in a position where you think the only way you can succeed is to copy from somebody else or to do the unethical behavior. Feldman points that out. Feldman also points out that low grades in particular, they don't really help students stay motivated to get better, but they actually cause them to withdraw. They feel bad about themselves. They check out of the class. I've certainly had students in my classes that when I was using grades, I felt like had that happen. And so that's just another thing where, sure, we'd like for our grades to be motivational to students, to be a signal that they need to get better, but unfortunately we're bringing them in and they have all these other downsides that come into play. And then just something that we've kind of noticed anecdotally, when we do point-based grades, students focus on the points, right? They'll argue with us over an extra point or two here or there. They want to know how many points is something worth. They don't really just care like, oh, I just want to learn the material, Andy, I don't care about the grade. And when we are assigning points for things, when we're doing our traditional grading system, that kind of motivation or demotivation is kind of boiled into it. And so we would recommend, that's something to keep in mind when we're doing our grading system is can we actually motivate them? One of the big changes that we've made from our traditional grading systems has been the factor of single opportunity grading. So that's the idea that, assignment 1 is due at this day, you're going to turn it in, you're going to get a score, and we're going to move on to other things. And then it's permanently in the grade book. Dr. East has a story where he had a student failed everything for 6 weeks. Just wasn't learning from their mistakes, but the student and Dr. East sat down. They talked about the kinds of things that he needed to be doing differently. He made some changes. He started to improve, and at the end, he was doing A-level work. He was arguably one of the best students in the class. However, and in this kind of class, like in many of our classes, it's kind of a cumulative effort. If you're doing A-level work at the end, that means that you know everything up until that point fairly well. So, what kind of grade should this student get? If we look at a fair grading system, an accurate grading system, you'd say, well, he's doing A-level work, he's demonstrated competence, he should get an A. But if we have this single opportunity grading system, this one-and-done grading system, then the failures they had those first 6 weeks can be even insurmountable. And I believe they ended up with a C- because, that's when we have this one and done. So as an alternative, we recommend allowing retakes either on the same assessment or similar assessments, or allowing this idea that, hey, if you do well on a future assessment and it's cumulative, then okay, we'll count that towards all the other objectives that you have behind. So kind of allowing that extra time. Another thing we tend to do would be use weighted categories. If we take a look on both the left and the right-hand sides. The left-hand side gives us a case where two students with different scores in different categories end up with the same final score. Again, that suggests that's inaccurate because some of them do not seem to have the same ability, say, on an exam as others. On the right-hand side, we see an example where students might, the same student might have gotten the same scores, but just in classes where the instructor weighted things a little bit differently. Again, ended up with two vastly different scores for the exact same student, exact same performance. These are things that are, again, highlighting to us the fact that when we use these weighted categories, we introduce this inaccuracy. And so alternative, we suggest that your grades, instead of weighting these different categories, they should more directly reflect your outcomes. So if I want students to do X, Y, and Z, I might say something like, if you demonstrate you can do X, you have a C. If you demonstrate you can do Y, you have a B, etc. And if you demonstrate you can do X, Y, and Z, it's an A. Something like that. So something where I can look at the scores, the scores line up more directly with the outcomes. Okay, so we've talked about some major problems that we've run into when we examined our quote-unquote traditional grading. We went through some of the common practices, and again, we include more details in the paper, and we'd encourage you to check that out if you're curious. So how can we go ahead and actually implement equitable grading? We've kind of based our work on kind of this idea of instructional design. We just kind of added an extra field to it. So for us, you can kind of think of it as maybe as 4 different steps. Number 1 would be to identify any desired outcomes that you have for the course. And again, this is good practice now. Anyways, when we do that sort of identification of outcomes, we also want to include any sort of soft skills. So going back to, say, the group work. If I really want students to learn how to work in the group, I need to identify that that's something that I want them to do. Once I've identified what it is that I want them to do, I need to identify what they need to do to convince me they can do it. That is, I need to create those assessments. They might be individual, like individual quizzes. They might be something like a bigger project that everybody does at the end. I know what the student want. I know what I want the students to be able to do. The outcomes. Now I need to design things that they can do to convince me they know how to do those. Finally, when I have that, then I can look back and think about how do I want them to learn that. So I can design the learning activities for each of those categories. They might line up closely with the assessments. They might not, like I had mentioned with this whole drill and practice idea. So what am I going to have them do for their homework assignments? What are we going to do in class? What can I do to teach them the skills they're going to be needed, or teach the skills needed to complete the assessments to demonstrate they learn the outcomes? And then we added this 4th step here. Once we've done all of that, then we should sit down and make sure that we have an equitable grading scheme. Okay, I know how they're going to learn. I know how I'm going to check if they learn. Now, how can I evaluate them so that it's accurate, so that it's bias resistant, so that it's motivational? What are some suggestions we have when we're creating the grading system? Again, we encourage you to only, or we found it helpful to only look at their assessments and exclude homework. So, yes, we give homework. We want them to do it, but it's done to help train them for the future assessments, and not to actually include in their grade. We like to count more recent or later assessments or reassessments. That we are always giving students a chance to retake something to improve their score. We removed all the behavioral grading. There's no attendance, no participation, no penalty for late work. We don't do extra credit. We want to get down to just the core accurate amount because, again, we want to make sure that we accurately reflect the learning outcomes. Again, there's details on this implementation, or some of these implementations, inside of the paper. I would like to share, some of our personal experiences, both the positive and the negative. When we chose to implement it, we found that the main challenge was just that move to being an outcomes-based assessments, and then separating the learning from the assessments. Again, all of our previous training, both as a student and as a faculty member earlier, was in the more traditional sense. It was a big step to move to that. Okay, now I actually want to focus on the outcomes and what they need to do to demonstrate that. And that's something that multiple people are struggling with, even outside of the equitable grading scheme. Once you have that, once you've identified these outcome-based assessments, everything else becomes a little bit easier. There is a lot of effort that we've had to put into retrain students. They might complete an assessment and we come back and say, well, no, this isn't correct. But trying to convince them this isn't a failure. This is rather just an attempt in progress. And convincing them, trying to keep them motivated to go ahead and try it again. Like we had mentioned, there's substantial work in the initial phases. designing multiple, or planning the outcomes, planning the assessments, perhaps multiple version of them. How are we going to teach them those kinds of things? And we're still, in fact, working on, how do we assess those kind of soft skills as well. So all of that is kind of a work in progress, things that have been taking up some time of ours. Probably one of the bigger things as well we're still working on is how we get feedback to students. So homework is no longer graded. It doesn't, we don't give it back to them and say 8 out of 10, but we still need them to know how they're doing. So we've been experimenting with things like in-class peer review, or worked examples. Things like that, because again, the feedback is an important aspect of it. Just because we're not grading homework doesn't mean we don't have to somehow provide them feedback. We've had quite a few positive results with it, however. Students overwhelmingly seem to enjoy it. We've had comments like they appreciate the ability to retake. They appreciate that it feels like they're focused on learning and not on points. They like that we have simplified criteria. It's no longer 10 weighted categories. It's more of a simple sum. We've had some of them comment that they like the lack of quote unquote busy work, because they don't have to do homework assignments if they can already demonstrate it in the assessment. So overwhelmingly, students seem to appreciate the revision of grading with an eye towards equity. As an aside, for both students and faculty, we've virtually eliminated scoring disputes. So since the issue isn't points anymore, it's overall outcomes. I don't think either one of us have had a single student come in and argue a point and leave frustrated. Usually they accept our judgments on that. And again, it's no longer about, there's no benefit in getting 2 out of 100 points extra, because there's not 100 points out of it. And from our side of things, we've really enjoyed it because we feel like we now spend less time grading and more time teaching and helping students learn. And of course, that's a very satisfying feeling for us. We get to use our expertise not as grade accountants, but rather as teachers, as subject matter experts. And that's definitely a very positive result. So kind of our closing thoughts, we went through a lot. We'd encourage you to check out the paper. We'd encourage you to check out Grading for Equity by Joe Feldman. Our goal would just be to encourage everybody to go back to look at your traditional practices, to rethink those, thinking about the 3 aspects of equitable grading, thinking about the points that we raised up here. We think if you do that, it's going to significantly improve, potentially even revolutionize how you approach it. For us, we feel like it has revolutionized how we approach our teaching and learning, and we're excited to continue this discussion with people, and try to get everybody excited and kind of thinking about this idea as well. So definitely, if you have any questions, feel free to contact either Dr. East or I. Thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. So there's our contact information. If you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to either one of us. We're happy to discuss it more. Thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of the conference.